The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Tonight, is fighting in the NHL making a comeback? Then, The Atlantic's Tom Nichols on the death of expertise. That's all ahead on The Agenda. For years, fighting was on the decline in the National Hockey League, and traditional enforcers lost their place on the roster. But is fighting coming back? It certainly was in that Four Nations Canada-USA game in Montreal, where there were 3 Pierce 6 brawls barely a minute into the game. We've also seen our share of brutal headshots in the Stanley Cup playoffs so far. Is the league succeeding at all in cutting down on those? Let's get into that with, in Calgary, Alberta, Ryan Pinder. He is co-host of Barn Burner podcast at Flames Nation. In the nation's capital, Sean McIndoe, senior NHL writer at The Athletic and co-host of 2 podcasts, Puck Soup, that's very cute, Puck Soup and The Athletic Hockey Show. And with us here in studio, Mary Ormsby, freelance journalist and former Toronto Star journalist for 35 years, and Ken Campbell, freelance hockey writer and a longtime writer at the Hockey News. And it's great to see you two here in our studio again. Mary, you and I go, oh my gosh, did we go way back?
We go way back,
We go back to the days of Studio 2. It's great to see you again. Ryan and Sean, thanks for being with us in Points Beyond. Let's just, what did Warner Wolf used to say? Let's throw to the videotape. This is how the Four Nations game that I just referenced in the intro started. And, well, let's watch and then discuss. Sheldon, if you would.
Drop the gloves right away. Matthew Tkachuk and Brandon Hagel right off the hop.
I don't think so either. Parayko's just waiting and...
Yep. Sam Bennett, Brady Tkachuk. So the Tkachuks both get involved early. And Sam Bennett's not going to back down even though he's outweighed. Binnington gets attention. We might have more. Parayko and Miller. And Miller dropped the gloves, and Parayko's going to answer. And Parayko's going to answer in a big way. 3 fights, 9 seconds. And both teams may need some reserves tonight.
3 fights, 9 seconds. Okay, Sean, start us off. How would you characterize what we just saw?
It was pretty loud in Montreal that night. I'll tell you that much. I know that a lot of us maybe want to shake our heads at hockey fights, and if you're not a hockey fan, you might not even really understand what that is, how it's allowed. But boy, you go back that night, Montreal was rocking, and it was a big, loud, excited crowd, and the fights were part of that.
Ryan, how would you characterize what we saw?
Well, there's a lot of build-up towards that event. How much did the players care about this event? Did it mean anything to them? Was it just some manufactured event from the league and the PA? And I think 9 seconds in, those questions were answered. You'd gone essentially a decade plus without best on best for Canada against USA. And when the players got that emotionally invested, where they chose to shed mitts to, I guess, start setting the tone about how much each country wanted to win, I thought it was the most exciting start to a hockey game I can recall in my life. I'm sure there's been some equivalents, but it didn't feel forced so much as organic, as weird as that sounds, with 3 fights in 9 seconds. And I don't know that you'd find a sporting atmosphere as turbocharged as that one that night. And of course, you also just had the very new tariff stuff and the booing of the anthem going on. It was politically charged. It was a perfect storm for an incredibly invested 2 teams on ice that night.
Mary, what did you see?
I was astonished to see that, actually, because it was reminiscent of hockey in the 70s and 80s. And I thought, wow, is the whole game going to be like this? And to some degree, I was thinking that it was staged because this was a round-robin game. all those elements that have already been mentioned were there, the political climate and the booing of the anthems and Canada's a 51st state, all of that. But it just smacked to me that it was a stage sort of, let's see what we can do here in the round robin in a game that didn't really matter, obviously, till, at that point.
So I'm hearing a hint of disagreement with Ryan, who said it was organic as opposed to staged. But,
Yeah.
I mean, there was WhatsApp threads going on before the game where the Tkachuk brothers said, we're going to start something.
Send in the message, yeah.
Ken, what'd you see?
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. I think it was anything but organic. I don't think it was spontaneous at all. It was completely staged, and we know that because the USA players were sending texts to one another saying, let's do this off the hop here. There was absolutely nothing organic about it. There was nothing emotional. What could have possibly happened in those 0 seconds before the puck was dropped that would have had these guys emotional? No, I thought it was garbage. I thought it was garbage. I thought it was a terrible look for the game. And then, as is often the case, they had the Dancing Bear show at the beginning of the game, and then people got down to actually playing the game and playing hockey, which happens often.
Ryan, you want to come back at that?
Yeah, I mean, look, the Americans could talk about it ahead of time. That doesn't mean that, the Canadians said, okay, guys, here we go. Now, remember, there's these 3 nights and 9 seconds. I mean, Ken, you're kind of suggesting the Canadians are expecting that. Is that fair? That's something that you can factually back up?
No, it has nothing to do with the Canadians expecting it. It had nothing. I mean, if you're getting attacked on the ice, you're going to respond. But there was nothing organic about it. There was nothing there was no spontaneity to it whatsoever. I mean, the Americans plotted to do this. The American players plotted to do this. They talked about it in a group text. They discussed it. They planned it. There was absolutely nothing organic about it at all.
So the question then becomes...
So, I mean, the Canadians didn't know it was coming, and they chose to respond whichever way they wanted, which was to decline fights or to accept them. So,
that happens all the time. That happens all the time in the NHL. When a guy drops his gloves, you just skate away and decline. Yeah, that happens all the time, Ryan.
We can look at the fight cards for Brandon Hagel and Colton Parayko and others. They're not regular scrappers. These were decisions that were unorthodox, to be sure. So I wasn't expecting Colton Parayko to fight. He's huge, but I believe he's fought less than 5 times in his career.
Yeah, he's actually not a fighter, even though he's a very big guy.
No.
I guess the question is, though, Sean, was it good for the game?
Well, I mean, that is the $1 million question, right? That clip that you just showed, those 3 fights in 9 seconds, were probably seen by more sports fans in North America than anything that the NHL has put out in years and years, including Stanley Cup finals, including All-Star games, whatever else you want to see. That moment on that Saturday night Montreal became a cultural phenomenon in a way that we have not seen in hockey. Now, is all press good press? Is all publicity good publicity? Or did that send maybe a wrong message to some hockey fans or not even hockey fans, sports fans out there, or even people who aren't sports fans saying, oh, this is hockey, right? This is the caricature of what I think of hockey. It's guys with no teeth punching each other. I see that argument. That said, look, that was actual passion there. That there was. And look, it was absolutely linked in to the things that were happening politically. You can't separate the two in the booing of the anthems and what have you. It absolutely got people's attention. And it turned the future game, the championship game a few days later, into a must-see event in a way that I don't know that anything else could have. And that game didn't have the fights. It didn't have the dancing bears, as Ken would say. It was pure hockey, and it was great hockey, and a whole bunch of people saw it that otherwise never would have.
And thankfully, the right team won. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Mary, let me try this with you. And we heard Ryan say it a moment ago, which was that was the greatest start to any hockey game he'd ever seen in his life. Mm-hmm. Kevin Bieksa, who's seen a few hockey games on the broadcast that night, said it was the greatest beginning of any hockey game he'd ever seen in his life. Mm-hmm. How about for you?
I have to say I don't like the fighting. I've seen my own kids get in fights when they played hockey, and I felt physically ill about it, especially when the helmets came off. So I'm seeing it from the perspective of a parent and a journalist, too. I just feel that the proof is that if the fighting happened in that round-robin game, but was unnecessary for the championship final, so it wasn't necessary. And for a league that's purportedly trying to cut down on violence, protect player health, protect player brains, to somehow still glorify that as the greatest thing that's happened to NHL hockey in a long time, it really strikes me as hypocritical and wrong. And I will just say very quickly, I was surprised that the montage leading into the Game 1, the Leafs in Florida on Monday night, and I don't know if the broadcaster was involved in this or the NHL approved it, but that montage full of clips, about a minute long, there were 2 fights in that montage. And during the game, too, there was a commercial for the Stanley Cup playoffs. You're still selling the Stanley Cup on fighting. There were fights, or at least some blood loss in one of those commercials, too. So I just find it's just so hypocritical to say we want to protect our players, but, you know, let's fight when we can, boys. It's a really good thing.
Ryan, what about that? Too much hypocrisy?
I think the part of being a hockey fan is understanding like that you are going to be a bit of a hypocrite if you enjoy a fight. Like you can't ignore the science on head trauma and CTE. But the NHL hasn't made that link. They won't publicly. And I'm sure there's good legal reason for them to do that, or at least good business reason to do that. You know, you probably owe a lot of people a lot of money if you acknowledge that and then continue to play the game the way you do. But it's contact sport, and this game without contact is not as interesting. And this is the entertainment business, and you can slow people down, and you can take out the hitting, and you can say no fighting. Your product's not as interesting. It's not going to sell as much. It's just a fact. Like, Mary might not have liked the start of that hockey game, but the vast majority of people holding TV remotes were not picking them up after that. And that's the business that this league and the PA are in. And they were the, you know, co-presenters of the tournament. The tournament went from, is this a laughingstock? I might not care, to immediately, you know, people in places where hockey's not on TV saying, can we get that game on? And I don't really buy the notion that because it didn't happen in the championship game, the fights didn't matter. The fights set the tone for how invested the teams were. The fights weren't, here's how we win the championship. We understand you don't win a fight, you get a trophy in this sport. But it was the first time the two teams had sent their best to play each other since Sochi in 2014. So it was a level of like, hey, remember we don't like you, and remember the lengths we'll go to beat you. So, you know, all those things combined, I just think you can't ignore what those fights did for the tournament, whether it's the bottom line, the ratings, the broadcasters, or just the common fans' interest, not even the sports fan. This transcended hockey fans.
Ken, you can't help but, when you were watching that game in real time, you could not help but be just astonished at how the game started. And kind of, you know, I'm sure there were a lot of people who were kind of turned on by the electricity in the building and how exciting it was. On the other hand, I wonder if there was a part of you that thought, these guys are no doubt killing themselves. They are prematurely ending their lives by pounding each other right now, mostly for our amusement. Did that cross your mind?
It always does. It always does. And I believe that the NHL has dodged many, many bullets on this, and that they are one very, very unfortunate incident away from a tragedy occurring. I honestly believe that's going to happen.
When you say a tragedy, you mean a death in a game?
I mean a death. Yes. I mean, it's already happened in senior hockey. Excuse me. It's already happened in senior hockey, and I think the NHL is one errant punch, one very, very bad incident away from a real problem here. But you know what? But I want to sort of touch on a couple of things that have been said. You know, Ryan talked about, you know, the physicality in the game and fighting in the game. Those are not mutually exclusive. You can have physicality in a game. You can have hitting. You can have big open ice hits. You can have a lot of physicality. You can have a lot of front net battles. You can have those sorts of things. You don't need to have fighting with it. They're not mutually exclusive. And the second thing I want to address is with these people who like fighting. And I actually respect Ryan's view on this, and I respect Sean's view on it. I just wish more people in hockey would just say, I like it. I like fighting. I like it. I enjoy it. It's great. But don't give me this garbage that it needs to be in the game, that it has to be in the game because it's a passionate game, because emotions are high. You know, there's a lot of sports where emotions are high and they don't have fighting. If you like it and you want it in the game, I totally respect that. I 100% respect that.
Just own up to it.
I like fighting. Okay. Just say it.
Let's bring some, I mean, at the risk of doing something heretical here, let's bring some facts to the discussion, shall we here? We've got a graph here. Sheldon, you want to bring this up? This is, we've tracked here the season. For those listening on podcast, I'll just describe this graph. We've got, seasons going back to 2005-06, and then fights per game. And it was less than a half a fight per game, I guess one fight every other game, essentially. And then as the years ticked on. By 2008-09, we're up to more than a fight every other game. And then for whatever reason, it starts to go down and down. And then we get to the COVID year where it's like 0.15 fights per game, almost nothing. But then it ticks up and up and up. Now, we're not where we were back in 2008, 2009, but we're higher than we were even just 5 years ago. So I guess, Sean, my question for you is, most of us here are old enough to remember the big bad Bruins of the 70s or the Broad Street Bullies of the 1970s. Do you miss that era of hockey?
That is the tough question because, look, do I miss it? Today, we know too much. I can't go back and watch, those 70s eras or, I came online as a hockey fan in the 1980s, the old Norris division. Every Saturday night on Hockey Night in Canada, the Leafs would be playing the Red Wings. And if the game was 5-1 with 10 minutes left, it wasn't like today where you just turned it off and said, well, the game's over. That was when you sat a little closer to your TV and said, okay, what's Bob Probert going to do now? What's, Wendell Clark going to do? We know too much now. You go back and watch that and you're seeing guys, maybe moments that you cheered for, that you remember, and you go, but we now know that guy had a lot of trouble later in life. That guy had a lot of health issues. That guy had a lawsuit against the league. I cannot go back and enjoy that. Now, if you could put the Men in Black little neuralizer in front of my face and take away what I know and take me back to those days where we didn't know it, maybe we should have, but where we didn't know it, we didn't think about it. Yeah, I did enjoy it. And I did find it a more entertaining product. And, I'll do what Ken's asking. And I'll just say, look, as a guy growing up as a hockey fan, I liked it better when we had that element of the game, not because I thought it made it safer, the safety valve or whatever else, because I thought it made the entertainment product more entertaining. I wish I didn't. I wish I could say that I was on the right side of it. And I'd like to think that I am now. But back then, yeah, it was a lot more fun to be a hockey fan because of this stuff.
So Brother Campbell is going to give you props for at least fessing up that you like the fights.
Absolutely.
Mary, I wonder, we saw, the goons, as they called them, the guys who sort of, that was their job, to fight. They virtually took that out of the game, for quite a patch when they changed the rules and, more speed in the game was allowed and no more hooking allowed and that kind of things. But the fighting is creeping up now. It's sort of coming back. Not like it was, but it's coming back. Does that concern you?
No, I would say it's more a mathematical blip. Really just a cluster of things happening right now. Because I think overall, the attention of the league and safety concerns and all that and salary cap issues, who are you going to hold on to? You a guy who can fight and hurt somebody, or, there's all those decisions to be made. So I think it's just a blip.
What do you say, Ken?
Well, it's interesting because, fighting now, to compare it to the 70s or the 80s or even prior to that.
There's no comparison.
Yeah, it's minuscule now. Yeah. There's almost no fighting in the NHL compared to that. And in those years, with the WHA and the NHL and prior to that, there were truly awful, grisly things happening on the ice that we never ever saw because because you couldn't put it up on YouTube 5 minutes after it happened. So comparatively, fighting is way down and almost eliminated, and it's been almost organically eliminated because of the fact that fourth line players now are hugely talented players. They can skate, they can score, they can fight as well, but they bring a much more of a dimension to the game, and you can afford to play those guys 7, 8, 10 minutes a game. Whereas if you've got, the one-dimensional enforcer, you can no longer have that guy on the bench playing 4, 5, 6 minutes a game.
He can't keep up.
He can't keep up, and you need that roster spot for someone who can actually play.
Ryan, I guess I should point out the obvious here. In the International Ice Hockey Federation, fighting is banned. In the Olympics, fighting is banned. In the European leagues, fighting is banned. Fighting, obviously, is still allowed in the NHL. Do you think it's inevitable that the NHL will someday mirror what the other leagues in this world are doing?
Not necessarily, and there's a few leagues in Europe you can fight. It's a huge draw in the UK, in the EIHL, and it sort of was a safe landing spot for a lot of guys that fought for many years in the NHL and could go get some education paid for them. And fans adored it, as you see everywhere, generally speaking. I don't think they need to, in the sense that, to Ken's point, like we're talking about it's at a third of levels from 08 or wherever the graph sort of had peaked there. And that's way down from the 70s and 80s. Like, the game has naturally moved well away from it, to the point where, if my math is correct, you're talking about once every 5 games there's a fight, that teams will go and collectively have less fights than single players used to have by a significant margin. The game's just simply moving that way. I mean, you could certainly chalk up the low point in the COVID bubble to no fans in the building, less energy, players being a little more cautious about close contact. I don't know. But generally speaking, for the last 5 years, it's a third of the levels of just a decade and a half ago. So that's not a level that I find alarming. And look, the important distinction here between 2 decades ago, 3 decades ago, and now is that players are walking in blind. Like, you don't have players that are saying, oh, geez, blows to the head is bad for my brain. I better rethink this. You have players that are incredibly well educated, that have had agents in their lives since their early teens, and that understand the risks involved with certain activities. And you also have players that are saying, I'm willing to take on those risks for the potential gains. So you look at someone like Rempe, who plays for New York and stands at 6'9", and, you know, fighting is his greatest tool in the league. And maybe he's an AHLer, maybe he's an NHLer without it, but he gets to add a zero to the end of his salary when he's in the NHL, if he really wants to, you know, fight, or at least offer the threat of a fight. He's not going in and saying, geez, I'm now 60. I wish I'd known about this CTE stuff. He knows, and it's a choice that he's ready to make. Just as a combat fighter, whether that's MMA or boxing or whatever, at this phase in 2025, would say, yeah, I understand there's injury risks involved here, but I'm willing to trade those for the financial gain. And I'm not really here to tell other people how they should make those decisions.
No, I get you. All right. Well, let's look at the other side of this.
Good at telling other people to say you can or can't do this. So, long story short, I think fighting's at such a low level, the league doesn't have to ban it. It's pretty much almost there.
Well, let me put the other argument on the table. Mary, I'll go to you first, then we'll get everybody on this. You know, we do remember back in the 1980s when Wayne Gretzky was absolutely lighting it up, that you didn't mess with Wayne Gretzky, because if you did, you had to deal with Dave Semenko, who was on his left wing, and taking care of him.
Right.
So there was this notion that the game polices itself. And, you know, if Semenko had to have the odd fight in order to make sure that his superstar was well cared for, that's the way it went. Did the threat of being beaten up by an enforcer, in some respects, make the game safer?
I think that's the tired old trope of policing the game.
Yep.
And that is just a way to keep saying, I like fighting. It's not, you know, it was the way it was because that's the way it was, I guess, back then. But when you go back to, I mean, to Ryan's point, you're talking about you are consenting to a certain amount of violence when you agree to play in the NHL. You know what the rules are. Everyone knows what the rules are. You know, but at some point, it's almost like a criminal code violation. With some things like, I agree to some violence. I know what the rules are, but I don't agree to be maybe getting beaten to a pulp and maybe have a life-altering injury, which, you know, knock on wood, hasn't happened.
Although we do remember in the 1970s, there were criminal charges laid at Maple Leaf Gardens.
Yes, very few. I mean, there should be no refuge from the Criminal Code of Canada, not even in hockey arenas, but it seems to happen.
Sean, what do you say about this policing of the game argument?
Yeah, I'm with Mary on this one. I don't buy it. I think it was a convenient way for those of us who enjoyed this stuff in the 80s and 90s. Even back then when we didn't necessarily know what CTE was, there was always that voice in the back of your head going, is this really safe? Is this okay? I mean, that guy's getting punched in the face. You know, and we always used to say, there was a saying, you heard it from Don Cherry and everyone else, nobody gets hurt in a hockey fight. Yeah. And the idea was nobody gets hurt in the sense of, you know, there's no permanent injuries. It's not like getting hit from behind or cross-checked in the face. You know, yeah, maybe you get your bell rung. Well, we know now what getting your bell rung actually meant. But even back then, we kind of understood that this doesn't seem, I don't want to get punched in the face. How come it's okay for this guy to do it? And, you know, we looked at it and we said, well, it's making the game safer. The proof is in the pudding, right? You look at the last 10, 15 years, as we've seen the enforcers leave the game. Brian Burke famously, when he had to send Colton Orr, his enforcer, down to the minors, said, I'm worried the rats are going to take over the game. And a lot of us kind of nodded along and said, yeah, that might happen. 15 years later, does anybody see a game infested by rats? Do we see cheap shots constantly? Yeah, we see them sometimes, absolutely. But do we see them more than we saw them in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s? I'll be honest with you. A lot of those cheap shots in the 80s and 90s, the real dirty stuff that was causing injuries, it was coming from the same enforcers who theoretically were there to prevent it. I don't see it out of control now the way that it was predicted 20 years ago would happen if we didn't have an enforcer on every team.
We just so happen to have some video of what Mr. McIndoe is referring to. Here we go. We know that headshots have become an increasingly big problem in the National Hockey League in particular. There are rules right now that prohibit checks where the head is the primary point of contact and such contact was avoidable. Here is a bit of a litany of what they're trying to get out of the game. Sheldon, roll it if you would.
Is that Mark Savard? I don't know. Left-handed shot, 91, and then there's the hit.
All right, this is from 2010. This is before they changed the rules. And Mark Savard is about to take, look at that, that is a brutal headshot. And he would only, after that, play 32 more games in the National Hockey League, and he would have to retire with post-concussion issues. And then, okay, I think we got another one. Well, I mean, here we are in the middle of the Panthers and the Leafs, so why don't we show the one from the other night where the Leafs goaltender, Anthony Stolarz, got it from a guy who we all loved when he was playing in the Four Nations because he was playing so well for Canada. But here's Sam Bennett. Okay, let's roll that one, Sheldon.
With Donovan able to keep it away from Reinhart. Oh, big hit by Hagel and a penalty.
Ekblad's going to come right down the boards. Oh, man, he gets his forearm right into the chin of Hagel.
Generate much. The two best chances tight around, it wasn't the knee, it was the forearm that went. Don't see an arm up. Stolarz seems to be okay.
Okay, that was Bennett at the end there, obviously, and then Ekblad on Hagel for the first hit. Ken, how, the game has tried, the game says it's trying to get these kinds of hits out of the game. How much success are they having?
Well, it's doing a great job, eh? Doing a great job of that right now. We've only seen a couple of them so far, and this playoff has been littered with them. Yeah, I mean, they are trying. Yes, they are trying. And that first hit that you showed on Mark Savard was the genesis of Rule 48, which governs headshots. And yes, they are doing a better job of governing against headshots. But on that Aaron Ekblad shot that you referenced first, there was no penalty called on that play.
Or on the Sam Bennett one.
Right. Or on the Sam Bennett one. There was no penalty called on that play. And Sam Bennett, 2 years and 1 day after he knocked Matthew Nyes out of a series with basically a
concussion.
body slam and a nice knee to the head, got a minor penalty for that. And guess who the two referees were in that game?
Same ones. Same
ones as were the referees the other night against Stolarz. Yeah. I mean, Sam Bennett, I mean, if it were any other player, if it were literally any other player except maybe Brad Marchand, we'd be saying, okay, maybe. But Sam Bennett,
he's got a history.
Why does Sam Bennett end up in these situations all the time? All the time.
Ryan, tell me, do you think they're doing a good faith effort to get those kinds of headshots out of the game?
Yeah, I do. I think they are, and I think that's why you saw suspensions for 2 of the 3 clips you showed for the postseason. I think the Sam Bennett one should have been penalized. I don't know whether I think it crosses the threshold for suspension if it's called appropriately on the ice. And I think there's important context there that, he takes a heavy shot to the face minutes before that. He stays in the game. The Leafs medical staff doesn't pull him. He's then later puking and leaving to the hospital. I don't know how you sift through and assign, which hit was the one that hurt him. But, yeah, you place your forearm on a goaltender's head area in the crease. I mean, that's a penalty. So that's just a missed call from the official. I think it would be foolish to compare the power of that blow to what Aaron Ekblad delivered because, one's full speed and following through and the other's a light bump to someone that may have just already suffered a concussion. But yeah, I think the league's trying, but I also think players aren't dumb and they understand that intimidation's a part of the formula in the playoffs.
Okay. Ken, quick follow-up here?
Well, a quick follow-up in that not only are they missing these calls, not only are they not being dealt with, these players are being rewarded. Aaron Ekblad in that game against the Tampa Bay Lightning came back to score the tying goal in that game, and the Florida Panthers went on to win in overtime. That could very well have changed the complexion of that series. And as far as Sam Bennett's concerned, Sam Bennett has a cap hit of $4.4 million, and he's an unrestricted free agent this year. That cap hit is going to go up to $7 or $8 million on a max deal. He is going to be rewarded. He's going to be rewarded for the way he plays the game. Because all these people who are clicking their tongues and wagging their fingers at him all want him on their team. And there's going to be a conga line to sign this guy in the offseason.
Mary, what's your view on whether the league is taking a genuine good faith effort to get this stuff out of the game?
A couple of things. A tripping penalty in hockey can be accidental, right? Not intentional. High stick can be accidental, not intentional. Why isn't any hit to the head in that cylinder that goes around your head, any hit that's incidental, accidental, why is that not an automatic penalty? I would think that would be something that would be a little tweak to a rule. Accidental or not, it's a penalty. And maybe that's some way to say, here's how serious we are. And I will also say, athletes are smart. They are smarter than you think. They can learn. They will know this is not a thing you could do if you sort of tweak those sorts of rules. And they would follow that rule.
Sean, how do you see it?
Yeah, I mean, I do think we have to give the league credit. That first clip you showed of that horrific hit on Marc Savard, that hit at the time was legal. There was nothing in the rule book that said you couldn't hit a guy like that. And the NHL eventually made changes, and now a hit like that would be a massive suspension. But Mary's right. They haven't gone as far as some would like them to go and just say any hit to the head is a penalty, no questions asked, the way that they have with, I mean, you shoot the puck over the glass. It doesn't matter if you're 10 minutes into overtime, it's an automatic penalty, but you hit a guy in the head and suddenly we're all trying to slice it thin. And that's what the league has tried to do. We've heard terms like principal point of contact, and now that's kind of out. And, there's other ways to look at it. I think the league is here, even though they have made good progress, they are very concerned about unintended consequences. They're very concerned about, if we say no more hits to the head, do we suddenly find out that maybe they're more common, or maybe they're harder to avoid, or maybe the result is players just stop hitting altogether, and then what does that do to the entertainment value of the product? And so this league, whether it's hitting or player safety or a million other issues, they always tend to go a little bit slower than you might like them to. They're very conservative by nature, small c conservative, and they don't want anything that's going to have an unintended consequence down the line. Because one thing I think they do understand is, if you make a big splashy change for player safety and it doesn't work out the way you want, it's very, very hard to go back. It's very, very hard to be allowed to do that. So I think they've been very cautious. Has it been too cautious? There's a good argument to be made.
We thank all four of you for coming into TVO tonight and helping us out with this very timely discussion. Ryan Pinder, Sean McIndoe, Mary Ormsby, Ken Campbell. Thanks so much, everybody. And of course, as we say in the province of Alberta, go Leafs, go.
That's not the Oilers.
In 2017, Tom Nichols wrote The Death of Expertise, the campaign against established knowledge and why it matters. The book has been translated into 14 languages and has proved to be, unfortunately, quite prescient. Nichols has recently come out with a second edition of the book, and we thought we'd bring him back to help us understand the ongoing problem with the death of expertise. He's also a staff writer at The Atlantic, and he joins us on the line from Middletown, Rhode Island. Tom, great to have you back on the program. How are you doing these days?
I'm good, Steve. Thanks for having me on again.
Glad to hear it. Well, you, of course, wrote about, in your last book, the economic downturn, how a pandemic might snap us back into our senses and get us to trust experts again. Both of those things happened. Are we any more in love with expertise today than we were when you first wrote that book?
Well, what an uncomfortable thing to say, that I wrote a book about expertise and I made a big prediction in it that turned out to be wrong. I thought that an economic downturn, a war, or some other international crisis like a pandemic might snap us out of it, because normally those are the times when people turn to experts. We've had a war in Ukraine going on for 3 years that has been kept contained to Europe through, I think, pretty agile international diplomacy. We avoided the gigantic recession that everyone was certain was going to happen after COVID by wise policy and adept policymaking, particularly here in the United States. And we defeated a pandemic in a year with a vaccine. And yet, after all this, people are angrier than ever at experts because they don't draw any link between the life around them. The fact that vaccines appeared in a year, that the economy never fell off a cliff, that we are not in the middle of World War III. They don't draw any connection between that and the actual activity of experts who are advising policymakers about how to get through these dangerous things. Instead, they focus, understandably, on things that they feel aren't working to their satisfaction. But I really underestimated the degree to which high standards of living and a kind of general social boredom would really contribute to this ongoing kind of narcissistic rejection of expertise, where people simply say, I can figure this out, I can do my own research, I know enough to grasp all of these issues.
In which case, are you prepared to conclusively say right here, right now, that the value of expertise is dead, at least to the greatest percentage of society?
It's not dead, but it has a really bad cold for now. When I wrote The Death of Expertise, I always made it a point to tell people it's not the death of actual expert ability. I mean, there are still surgeons and there are still diplomats and there are still scientists and, military officers and other expert teachers in every field. But the real problem is respect for expertise. People is dying and in pretty critical condition. People walk into their doctors and they don't say, okay, tell me what's wrong with me. And if I don't like what I'm hearing, I'll get a second opinion, which, every doctor would encourage you to do. Instead, they walk in and they say to their doctors, here's what's wrong with me, and here's what you're going to do. Here's what you're going to prescribe me. Here's the procedure I'm hiring you. I've actually had doctors say this to me, where patients have come in and said, I am engaging your services here to do this procedure. That is the real problem. And I think that's where society, especially a democratic society, just can't function that way. We can't function without a sensible division of labor.
But Tom, surely you know that a half an hour of research on the web has got to be equivalent to 10 years of med school.
My father, who was a working guy, didn't finish high school, worked in a factory. He used to nudge me and when I was younger and full of myself. And he'd say, remember, it takes about 2 decades to get 20 years of experience, which he thought was really funny. But look, there are things that you can inform yourself about. I don't want people to walk away from this and say, well, I should just do whatever I'm told. Doctors, to go back to doctors, an obvious target of this kind of distrust after the pandemic. Doctors are very happy to talk to informed patients. Doctors, in my experience, love answering questions, and in fact, will answer them, at length if you ask them. But I think the bigger problem here is that people have so many competing claims about expertise that they cherry pick the ones that they're comfortable with. You pick the guy who says, you don't need to get a vaccination. I know vaccinations scare you. So I found this one doctor who said, don't get vaccinated for measles. That is not how science works. That's not how we got to this high standard of living here in the 21st century. I should add, look, I'm sure there are people watching this saying, but experts do fail. Experts make huge mistakes. And I talk about that. There's a whole chapter in both the first and second edition of this book about, howlingly bad calls by experts.
We will get to that.
The problem is...
Yeah, we will get to that. Don't give up the plot yet, because I'm not ready to go there yet. There is an interesting couple of points that you make in your book, though, as it relates to reasons why you think we have a distrust in experts right now. And a couple of the reasons you've pointed to are boredom and high living standards. We need to know more about that. Go ahead.
Well, part of the double-edged sword of high living standards is that everything looks easy. When I'm 64, so I grew up as a small child in the 1960s. And it's funny, people would say to me, the 60s, wow, that must have been really cool. And my wife and I, who are the same age, we always tell younger people that the thing we remember about the 1960s is no air conditioning and people smoking in hospitals. People smoking around oxygen tents. And then, of course, you get my younger students, back when I was teaching undergraduates, they would say, what's an oxygen tent, professor? And I think when you've reached a certain standard of living, you just take it for granted that, of course, a heart attack only lands you in the hospital for 3 days. Of course, everything is air conditioned. Of course, nobody smokes in school. Because these are all things that are now woven into your life and seem easy to do. And I would argue that this is replicated at the level of national policy, that since the end of the Cold War, where we don't really think about things like World War III, nuclear weapons, we look and we say, well, how hard can it be to be a president or a prime minister? Anybody can do this. The world kind of runs on autopilot. Interest rates are low, and they're always low because they're supposed to be. And peace is the default state of the world, and so on. And I think that's the problem with high living standards. The problem with boredom is that people have lots of leisure time to spend plowing through kind of the dumpsters of the internet. Now, I'm a huge nerd and fan of the internet. I'm even a video gamer, even at my age. But, to simply sit on your Facebook page or, going through Reddit or whatever your social media of choice is, and simply plowing through stuff that hasn't been vetted, hasn't been edited, could have been put there by malicious actors, really, I think, has been frying people's brains. And they need to unplug, both from the internet and I think from a lot of cable television. I mean, I'm paid to have opinions, and I probably don't watch as much cable news as the average American does. People really need, I know it's a cliche, but people really need to disconnect and touch grass for a while.
Well, I'm 6 months older than you, so I certainly know where you're coming from as it relates to all these things you just referenced, but I do want to circle back to the comments you made about the economy, because I suspect that if you asked people today about the state of the economy and certainly the economic power they feel they have, I suspect, 90% of society would say it's way worse now than it was 20 years ago, and it's far more chaotic than it was. Are things actually better than we think?
Of course they are. There's a thing called, that sociologists call hedonic adaptation. That is, that when things get to a certain standard, that becomes the new floor. And as an example, if you grew up sleeping in a twin bed, as I did in the 1960s, if you then sleep in a full-size bed or a queen-size bed, it's hard for you to go back. The next time you sleep in a twin bed, you say, it's really uncomfortable, it's too small, because you're used to the new higher standard. I am amazed, especially when younger people say to me how terrible they think the economy is. I had a student say to me some years ago, he said, well, this is just the worst economy ever, probably in the in 30 or 40 years. And I said, spoken like someone who didn't live through the 1970s. And, Steve, you and I are the same age. And I went on to tell these younger folks about why I remembered my license plate number, because I could only buy gas on even numbered days. Mm-hmm. And it was a great moment because some of these students kind of looked at each other, with this sort of look and said, is he lying about this? That couldn't have happened.
That did happen.
When I graduated from college into double-digit unemployment and inflation and 18% interest rates, if we had the economic situation today that we had 45 years ago, people would be, burning bonfires in the streets. I mean, they wouldn't even be able to conceive of it. But we've accepted as the new normal that unemployment is always between, 3 and 4%, that interest rates, if they get to 7%, are high, even though historically that's where they've usually been. We think that 3 or 4% inflation is disastrous when in fact we lived for years with 8, 9, 10% inflation.
Yeah.
So it's very hard to get people to accept that experts have made the world better if they don't think the world is better.
Mm-hmm. Understood. Let me ask you about DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, and whether you believe the laying off of tens of thousands of government employees in your country represents an attack on expertise. What do you think?
Oh, it's absolutely an attack on expertise because it's hand in hand with the Trump administration's attempt to politicize the American civil service. Experts are always the default enemies of authoritarianism because an expert is the person who has to, whether he or she wants to, an expert is always the person who has to say no. If somebody comes in and says, listen, we need water to boil at a higher temperature today, we just can't do that. That's not how water works. I need this hurricane to move over here. We don't have that power. Doge, I think, was just an experiment in social revenge from people who felt that they'd been kept out of jobs that they wish they'd had. And so they decided that the right answer to this was to wade in and start firing people simply because it felt good and because it looked like activity. The fact that we've had to hire back so many of those people tells you about the role of expertise and the need for an apolitical civil service. But make no mistake, this administration, the Trump administration, really hates experts and doesn't want to hear from them because when the president says tariffs work, trade wars are easy to win, I can solve Ukraine in a day, the experts are the ones that, by their duty to society and to their profession, have to sit in the back of the room and shake their heads and say, that's not going to happen.
It's interesting that we seem to, or many people at least, seem to imbue in the very rich, like Elon Musk, like Peter Thiel, a sense of, well, if they're brilliant enough to have created this incredible car company or this space company or this computer company, then clearly they must have the ability to organize a government department or know a great deal about politics and history. In your experience, can you connect those two things?
It's a peculiar, I shouldn't say peculiar because I'm sure it happens in other nations, but it is in the United States, it has long been a conceit that if you are good at business, you're good at everything. Because Americans, being the go-go capitalists that we are, and let me just say for the record, I love capitalism, but I don't believe it solves every problem in the world. Unfortunately, even going back to, say, the Kennedy administration, when Robert McNamara is pulled from General Motors in to run the Defense Department, we make this mistake in the United States over and over and over again, that we don't realize that business and politics are two different skill sets. We did it again bringing in Donald Rumsfeld, right? He ran a big pharmaceutical company. Of course, he can save money at the Defense Department. It really is. It's just, I don't want to say it's a dumb idea, but it's a terrible misapprehension that Americans simply refuse to let go of. They figure if you got rich selling books at Amazon or making cars at Tesla or, buying real estate, then you must be good at everything. And that is really a pernicious and dangerously uninformed idea.
Let me set up this next question by playing a clip of a guy who millions of Americans, and I suspect a lot of Canadians as well, really like. His name's Joe Rogan. He's got a show that millions of people watch and listen to. And he has amateur historians on his program, including someone who argued that it was actually Winston Churchill and not Adolf Hitler who was responsible for World War II. The writer Douglas Murray, who was recently on the Rogan podcast, tried to take on that view. Here's a clip and then we'll come back and chat. Sheldon, if you would.
I'm still slightly bemused about this move from I'm an expert on this and I have views to I'm a comedian.
I've never claimed to be an expert on anything.
This is the problem, Joe. I mean, if somebody
Wait a minute,
says...
you have to claim to be an expert on something to have an opinion on something?
No, you don't have to be. You don't have to be. But
so what's
this is
the
like,
issue?
I'm not a historian, but I'm pumping out history.
But wait a minute,
I'm not an expert, but I'm talking all the time about this
But you're not
thing.
even talking about specifically on what he just said.
No, I'm saying, this is my point about this. You say... I'm not an expert.
So what's the solution? To not talk about it?
No, it's to have more experts around.
Are we living in a time now where it seems as if those with strong opinions who are good behind a big fat microphone are more prized than people who actually know stuff?
Yeah, they're more interesting. It's more fun. I mean, who wants to listen to facts and experts, explaining history to you when two guys can sit around and kind of, just BS their way through a conversation? I mean, who doesn't like that? That's why we go to bars and hang out and talk with our friends over beers, right? But Murray's point is really important. You don't have to be an expert, but you have to have at least some foundational knowledge. There has to be some reason that you are sitting behind that microphone, pumping out your opinion, potentially to millions of people. And guys like Rogan, who have done so much damage, they jump back and forth. They say, well, I'm just asking questions. Okay, you are, but you're asking stupid questions. You're asking uninformed questions. You're doing it to get people hooked on, the scary secrets that supposedly, you're plowing into here. And the reason this is happening, and I talk about this in the book, is that there is just so much bandwidth available that there's no longer any gatekeeping whatsoever. There was once a time where if Joe Rogan, and I don't even know who the other guy was, walks in and says, oh, I don't know what we're talking about, and we're not experts, we're just a couple of guys, a television station or a radio station would say, well, that's all very nice, but we don't usually televise, Cliff and Norm at the end of the bar at Cheers talking about stuff. We need to reserve the viewers' time for people who know what they're talking about. But literally now we are taking the equivalent, of putting a camera, and saying, hey, you two guys, go ahead and just talk, because we have all the bandwidth. And this goes back to the boredom problem. We have a public that has all the leisure time in the world. The same people that say, I am too busy to read a newspaper for 30 minutes will listen to this junk for hours. And it's just destructive, but it helps. But people find it comforting because people don't go to these sources for information. They go to them for confirmation. Mm-hmm. And that they cherry pick and then find people they already agree with and say, yeah, I now feel informed.
Well, now here's where, as promised, we're going to circle back, and I'm going to come at you, Tom Nichols, and say, yeah, but wasn't it your experts that got us into Vietnam and Afghanistan and Iraq, and so much expertise was so awful in all of those cases that it has begat all of what we've just been discussing? What about that?
Let me put in a special pleading here about Vietnam, because people really misunderstand that one because of the title of the book, The Best and the Brightest. People who often cite that book haven't read it. What happened in Vietnam was that there were experts, China, Indochina, Japan, Vietnam, Malaysia experts, and they were pushed aside by people who thought of themselves, people like McNamara, right? I ran a car company. I'm smart too. They were pushed aside by people who had good educations and thought of themselves as very smart, but they weren't really experts. The tragedy of Vietnam is that the experts were the ones saying, this is not a good idea. So on this, I will say Vietnam's an important case where people get that wrong, that if we had listened to more experts, we may not have even gone down that road. With Iraq and Afghanistan, whether or not to topple a regime that you think is a threat to American national security is a political judgment call. The experts, however, bent their expertise on the issue of WMD. When the CIA director said, slam dunk, that there are WMD there, I think a lot of us really felt betrayed by George Bush when he gave a medal to George Tenet for that. Instead of firing him. And it happens. It happens in political. Now, again, let me throw this back to the voters and say, and yet in 2004, George Bush won a larger majority as president than he did in 2000.
Yep.
He actually won an outright victory in 2004. So, the people who complain about these things often are the voters who refuse to hold their own people responsible. But again, let me just point out that we've also now, as of this year, it has been 80 years since the end of World War II, and people doing their best, and I think successfully, despite Vietnam, despite Afghanistan, despite Iraq, we have managed to keep a world peaceful without the use of nuclear weapons and without a global war for 80 years. I think most people don't realize what an astonishing achievement that is when compared to the bloody history of the 20th century. And I think they take the world they live in for granted without realizing that it was constructed, that the system of free trade, high living standards, peace, cooperation, free travel, the freedom to travel, were all constructed by experts. They live in a world built by experts, and I think sometimes people they fail to appreciate that because of the, again, admitted and astonishingly large mistakes that some experts have made in the past.
In which case, let's finish up on this. 8 years ago, you brought this book out. 8 years later, we're having a conversation in which so many of the things you hoped would happen have not happened. If we have this similar conversation 8 years from now, do you have any reason to be any more optimistic about where we'll be in 8 years' time?
I guess I wonder if finally getting what you want, if the people who really deplore expertise and, really want to punish the experts and push them out of public life, I sometimes wonder if getting what you want is the path to realizing how wrong you are. I mean, we had these arguments bubbling around about vaccines that came to a fever pitch, no pun intended, during COVID. But now we're having major outbreaks of measles in the United States. And I hate to think this way, but maybe after enough measles cases, maybe after enough children are sick, that people will step back and say, I have my issues and questions, but maybe I ought to get my kid vaccinated because this is bad. So maybe after all this economic chicanery about tariffs, I mean, the president and his chief trade advisor are pretty much the only two people in the Western world left among economists who believe in this theory about tariffs. Maybe after, prices get high enough and inflation gets bad enough, that people will say, maybe we ought to listen to sensible economists and not do this.
Tom, it's always great to have you join us on our program. The name of the book, one more time, is The Death of Expertise, the campaign against established knowledge and why it matters. And it always matters when Tom Nichols shows up on TVO. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you, Steve.
And that is the agenda for Wednesday, May 7th, 2025. Tomorrow on the program, 3 historians join us on the 80th anniversary of VE Day, Victory in Europe, for a look back and a look forward. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org, and we'll see you again tomorrow.